Lying in bed and holding my wife close, I thought about my day. It started with a job I enjoy and ended with my wonderful family. I had fun playing with my kids, sharing a meal, and watching baseball together. Later, after the kids were asleep, my wife and I shared a loving moment in our bedroom. We cuddled and kissed, feeling content. As my wife fell asleep, I wrapped my arm around her and felt happy. Sure, my life might seem ordinary to some, but to me it's perfect. Regrettably, I wasn't aware that it would be the final normal day like that. The phone rang just before noon. Carrie's voice trembled with tears and panic, making it hard to catch everything she said. From what I gathered, it had to do with our son, Troy, his kidneys, and the hospital. Promising to meet her there in 20 minutes, I rushed out, quickly briefing my boss on the situation. In less than 20 minutes, I arrived at the hospital, miraculously avoiding any traffic violations. Dr. Michael Fierstos briefed me in the ER, where Troy had been brought in, doubled over in pain. The sudden shift from a healthy freshman to stage 3 chronic kidney disease baffled the doctor, who awaited a specialist's assessment. Though Carrie and I attempted to keep up appearances for Troy, it weighed heavily on us. While Carrie researched the condition on her phone, I stayed close to Troy, trying to keep the atmosphere light. However, Carrie's pallor and tearful glances signaled a grim prognosis for our son. The specialist, Dr. Brendan Nicholas, confirmed our fears 45 minutes later. He stressed that Troy urgently needed a kidney transplant to have a chance of making it to high school graduation, even with dialysis. Considering he was only 14, Troy handled the news surprisingly well, although he couldn't hold back the tears. I couldn't blame him. Carrie joined him in crying moments later. Dr. Nicholas explained that while kidney transplants were common nowadays, finding a suitable match wasn't guaranteed. Ideally, a family member would be the best match, but our options were limited. I was an only child, and Carrie's sibling had young children who couldn't donate. Even Troy's 17-year-old sister was ineligible. Despite testing 7 family members, including grandparents, none were viable donors. It was a devastating blow to our family. Despite our despair, the doctors remained optimistic, albeit cautiously. Still, Troy's situation looked grim. Tears were shed at the hospital and in our home for a week after we received the disappointing news. To borrow a line from Monty Python's Flying Circus, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Similarly, nobody anticipates a miracle, but that's exactly what seemed to happen about a week later. And it came from an unexpected place halfway across the globe. Carrie and I reached out to Sergio Santiago, an 18-year-old whose parents were close friends with us, almost like family, although technically we weren't related. However, it turned out that Sergio was a match for Troy in a 3-way transplant. Having a family match is the best option, Dr. Nicholas emphasized, clearly excited about the news. And a half-sibling is almost as good as a full sibling. But Doc, he's not a half... Oh no, I exclaimed, realizing the implications as Dr. Nicholas watched in shock. My mind struggled to process the revelation. Initially, I saw it as a miracle for Troy. Then it dawned on me that it could mean the end of my marriage. I glanced at Carrie, who appeared to shrink before my eyes. Carrie, sweetheart, I murmured, feeling overwhelmed. She turned away, her face flushing deeply. I stood silently waiting for her response. Seconds ticked by, then minutes. I cleared my throat. Right now, my focus is on Troy, she finally spoke, her voice firm. I had to make the call. It was for Troy. Thank you for considering someone else this time, I replied flatly. With our attention on Troy, we hoped for a miracle, even as our marriage seemed to crumble. After several minutes of silence, Carrie met my gaze, her eyes narrowing. Not now, Josh. I can't deal with this right now. I grasped her message and acknowledged it, though it didn't offer much comfort. When are they arriving? I inquired. They're due here next Thursday, she replied softly. Great. They can stay with us, like always, I assured. Over the years, the Santiagos had lodged with us about 6 times. We had set up our basement as a guest suite with a master bedroom, a smaller room, and a full bath. It wasn't as fancy as the 5-star hotels they usually frequented, but they were family. Family? Well, that's debatable. Carrie and Robbie were roommates during their final 2 years at Iowa State University. Robbie and Jorge were already a couple when I began dating Carrie just before Christmas of our junior year. It took some time for me to warm up to Jorge. He hailed from a wealthy Spanish family and had the air of a spoiled playboy. Yet I eventually realized he was genuinely kind, just inexperienced outside his privileged bubble before coming to the United States for college. We gradually developed a solid friendship, although much of it revolved around our significant others. Both Carrie and Robbie were not just roommates, but also best friends, leading to campus rumors that their bond was more than platonic. However, I never saw any evidence supporting those rumors. George and Robbie tied the knot 6 months after our graduation. Carrie served as the maid of honor, and I attended as a guest. In turn, Robbie stood beside Carrie as her matron of honor at our wedding in Champaign, Illinois, 6 months later, with Jorge present as well. Our lives became incredibly hectic. Alongside Troy requiring daily dialysis, there seemed to be a constant presence of medical professionals. There were numerous considerations, from the impending surgery and post-operative care to the medications and psychological aspects. The thought of burdening a 14-year-old with such a heavy load was unfathomable to me. Troy was understandably frightened, and I empathized with him. He was typically a robust, witty kid, but this situation had him feeling vulnerable and in pain. It pained me deeply to see him suffer, knowing there was little I could do to alleviate his discomfort. I recognized that Carrie was just as distressed about our son's situation as I was, so I avoided addressing the issue of her affair, allowing it to linger silently. During the following week, I worked half days, providing a positive distraction from both Troy's illness and my wife's infidelity. Despite my efforts to suppress it, Troy's condition weighed heavily on my heart, while Carrie's betrayal felt like a gut punch. Work became my refuge from the pain. Carrie and I seldom had moments alone over the next few days. When we were together at home, our daughter, Anjuli, AJ for short, was always present, hindering any private conversation. Our time alone in the bedroom was strictly for sleeping, as exhaustion often granted relief. Under ordinary circumstances, the arrival of the Santiagos would have sparked a joyful atmosphere. While there were the customary hugs exchanged, I remained aloof, wrestling with a mix of emotions including anger and nausea. It took several minutes before Robbie noticed me, her demeanor shifting as she approached and embraced me tightly, whispering an apology in my ear before stepping back. As I glanced around, I realized everyone's eyes were fixed on me. Neither Troy nor AJ were informed of their biological connection to Sergio. They viewed Sergio's compatibility with Troy as a remarkable coincidence, a detail we, the four adults, chose to keep to ourselves for the time being. Sergio had been aware of the connection for about the past 4 years, as I later discovered. Carrie mentioned that he was okay with his parents' explanation of the situation. It seemed that everyone who knew was accepting of it. Perhaps one day, when I had come to terms with it, I would be okay with it too, although I highly doubted it. Once everyone had settled in, Carrie left for the hospital with the Santiagos to visit Troy. AJ and I stayed behind. After Carrie's SUV had driven away, AJ approached me. "What's going on, Dad?" she inquired. "I'm not clueless. Something's definitely up between you and Mom, and it seems to involve Aunt Robbie and Uncle Jorge, too. If you don't tell me, I'll just ask Sergio. I'm sure he knows and he'll spill everything. He tells me everything." There are both advantages and disadvantages to having highly intelligent children. One downside is that it's hard to keep things hidden from them. AJ was exceptionally bright. I thought it best to be honest with her, even though I didn't have all the details. This way, she would hear the truth without any bias that might come from my wife's perspective. I explained to her what I had pieced together, which wasn't much. Her mother had cheated on me with Jorge Santiago during one of my long deployments, resulting in the birth of Sergio, who turned out to be a half-sibling to both her and Troy. That's why Sergio was such a perfect match for Troy's transplant. "Wow," she uttered softly. "Wait, you didn't know about this until Troy got sick, did you? That's why you've been giving Mom those looks for the past week or so." I nodded in agreement, feeling my cheeks flush with embarrassment. At that moment, I felt like the biggest fool on earth. Little did I know, there was more to unfold. "So, you weren't aware that Mom stayed in the bedroom with Aunt Robbie and Uncle Jorge when we visited them in Spain all those years? They didn't stop until I was about 12. Mom always explained it as her and Aunt Robbie being like sisters, and you were aware of it," she revealed. My jaw dropped in sheer astonishment. I was rendered speechless. It seemed there was no need for me to respond to her inquiry. "Oh my God, I'm sorry, Daddy," she exclaimed. "I always found it kind of strange, but I was just a kid. She told me you knew. I believed her." "Damn," I managed to utter. "What's your plan?" she whispered again. "For now, nothing. We need to get through Troy's surgery first. Then we'll address it. Thoroughly, I'm sure," I assured her. We would prefer if you didn't tell anyone until after we've talked," I requested. "Yeah, sure, Dad," she agreed. "I've got your back on this, Dad." Thanks, sweetheart, I replied. I'll admit I felt uneasy around my wife and the Santiagos. I noticed they were giving me a lot of glances, and they seemed to be engrossed in whispered conversations. Back at the house on Friday night, Sergio approached me quietly. Can we talk just you and me, Uncle Josh? It's important, he requested. How could I refuse, Sergio? You're the one saving my son. And your half-brother, I acknowledged quietly, noticing his raised eyebrows. Sergio and I strolled around our neighborhood. Listen, Uncle Josh, I know this whole situation is awful and awkward. I'm grateful I can support Troy, he expressed. But I have to ask you for a favor, just between us. I feel like I've earned the right to ask. I need you not to divorce Aunt Carrie because of this, and I need you not to seek revenge on my dad physically, Sergio pleaded. I could sense the turmoil in his eyes. I examined his handsome face closely. He strongly resembled Jorge, but now that I knew what to look for, I could also see a bit of my wife in him. Come to think of it, he did bear a striking resemblance to Troy. How had I never noticed that before? I can't promise I'll stay with my wife beyond Troy going off to college, but I can commit to not seeking physical revenge on your father. That's the best I can offer, Sergio, even with everything you're doing for me. And yourself, I suppose, I replied. How are you dealing with all of this, Sergio? How do you feel about Aunt Carrie and being Troy's half-brother? I inquired. I was pretty shaken when I first found out, honestly, he admitted. But I wouldn't even exist if Dad and Aunt Carrie hadn't agreed to have a child together. Mom is my mom in every way, and Aunt Carrie is still Aunt Carrie. Although now I guess I have even more affection for her in my heart. And I've always considered Troy like a little brother anyway. I think it's pretty cool that he's my brother, and I'm really glad I can help him. We walked back to the house in silence, Sergio's words weighing heavily on my mind. He had shed light on more aspects of the situation, leaving me to grapple with the harsh reality of it all. The transplant took place the following Tuesday, with 5 of us anxiously waiting. Both boys came out of surgery well, and Troy's new kidney began functioning right away, which the doctors assured us was a positive sign. Exhausted, we left the hospital that night. I didn't think much of it when Robbie offered to accompany me to pick up our Chinese takeout a couple of days after the surgery. However, during the ride, she started apologizing, and in the span of the journey, I learned the entire truth. By the time we returned home, I had lost my appetite. I've been in the Naval Reserve for 2 decades, with 3 deployments overseas. The first occurred shortly after Carrie and I got married. During that time, she stayed with Robbie and Jorge for the entirety of my deployment to the Mideast. It shouldn't have happened, but it did. I'm sorry, Josh, she began. We were partying one night and things got out of hand, leading us to end up in bed together. That's when I came up with what turned out to be the worst idea ever. I never told anyone but Carrie, but I can't conceive children, and I desperately wanted them. So I thought she could become pregnant by Jorge, have the baby, and I could adopt it. We'd raise the child, and you'd never have to know. The plan seemed foolproof. Carrie gave birth to a beautiful baby boy, and by the time you returned 6 months later, she had shed most of the baby weight. We simply passed off any changes to her appearance as a result of our indulgent meals, and you were none the wiser, until Troy fell ill. Robbie lowered her head, her cheeks flushing slightly. I waited for her to continue, sensing there was more to the story. After a moment, I spoke up, mentioning my conversation with AJ and leaving the rest to Robbie. She responded with a whispered, "Oh, I know they didn't just hook up once. I may not have known everything, but I'm not oblivious," I remarked pointedly. Robbie confessed, "No, it wasn't just a one-time thing. They were involved long before she got pregnant. And they continued after. It evolved into more than friendship right under your nose. They became lovers. I didn't anticipate that. But at that point, I had to make a choice. I had my child, and I loved Jorge and Carrie, so I decided to stay and be a part of their lives, instead of driving them away." She continued, recounting how they would spend time together during my deployments and vacations, eventually taking separate trips as AJ grew older and began to sense something was amiss. "Don't be angry, Josh. Everyone benefited from it. I gained a son, Jorge and Carrie had their time together, and your son received a new kidney," Robbie urged. "That's not how I see it, Robbie," I replied firmly. "The kidney was coincidental. From my perspective, everyone else gained something except me. I wasn't a part of the agreement between the 3 of you. I didn't consent to my wife carrying a child for you or to her having a 19-year affair. It makes me wonder, maybe I was the one on the side. He was her first love. and I was just a substitute. You might have settled for just a part of your husband's affection, but I can't settle for just a fraction of my wife's love. I'm someone who wants everything or nothing, Robbie. You should have known that about me, and my wife definitely should have. So where do we all stand now, Josh? She inquired. I'm not sure, but I made a promise to Sergio that I'll stay with Carrie at least until Troy is living on his own, and I won't harm your husband, I replied. How could you and Jorge betray me like this? I thought we were friends. Practically family. Family doesn't do this kind of thing to each other, Robbie. As we pulled into the driveway, our conversation came to a halt, at least for the time being. Both boys were discharged from the hospital and back home within a week. It's truly incredible what modern medicine can achieve. Barring any unexpected complications, Troy should have a long, healthy life ahead of him, and the same goes for Sergio. The unspoken tension lingered until the night before the Santiagos were set to return home. I arranged for AJ to keep the boys entertained in the family room with a zombie series and pizza. Meanwhile, the adults retreated to my home office where I had prepared wine and a charcuterie board. Entering the room, I couldn't help but notice Carrie and Jorge seated closely on the love seat while Robbie sat alone in the chair. I arranged the refreshments on the coffee table and took a seat in my desk chair. As everyone served themselves, I kicked off the conversation by commending Sergio once again for his readiness to help out, a testament to Robbie and Jorge's parenting. Carrie echoed my sentiment, and I could sense Sergio's parents must have been beaming with pride. However, beyond being incredibly angry at both of you, I said, directing my gaze at the pair on the love seat, if I hadn't promised Sergio, you might both be in serious trouble right now. And you, I added, turning to Robbie, would be lying there wounded, wishing you were dead. How could the person who was supposed to love me above all others do this to me? Cheat on me repeatedly and secretly have another man's baby? Continue to engage in a relationship with her lover for the next 18 years. Yeah, I know all about that now. You did this practically in front of my kids. All three of them flinched at my direct use of strong language. Carrie seemed like she wanted to say something, but thought better of it. I understood. Oh, damn, I muttered. You two have been intimate since they've been here. How many times? Once? Twice? Every single day? She bowed her head and remained silent. I glanced at Horish, then back at Robbie. Only twice that I know of, Robbie eventually responded. Wow, seriously? I whispered. You couldn't keep it out of our bed. Carrie kept her gaze fixed on the floor. Damn. I understand now, Carrie. I might be slow to catch on, but it finally clicked. You might love me. Maybe. But you're in love with him. He's your top priority. I'm just second best, just like Robbie is to Horsch. Tell me I'm wrong. The room might as well have been silent, with no one saying a word. I finished my glass of wine and poured myself another, offering to pour for the others, but they all declined quietly. I love you, Josh. I never left you for him. We only got together when you weren't around, Carrie finally spoke, breaking the silence. That's quite a statement, babe. But you took away trust, loyalty, and commitment, I retorted. Our vows didn't include a hall pass if one of us was unavailable, especially 19 years ago when I was serving in the Mideast. While I was risking my life, you were enjoying yourself in Spain, getting pregnant by him and having his baby. We don't even need to discuss the other times you two were together. At least you realized you should be discreet around our kids and started seeing him elsewhere. Except for this week, apparently. The others in the room remained quiet, avoiding eye contact. It's a miracle you had a son to help Troy, I continued sarcastically. I guess outing yourself was the last thing you wanted, so I appreciate that. Finally, a selfless act from the ultimate selfish woman. Robbie was sobbing, Jorge looked guilty, and Carrie's expression shifted between guilt, fear, and anger. Now where do we go from here, Josh? I don't want a divorce, Carrie began. Because of my promise to your son, and because I don't break promises or vows, you have 4 years before I file for divorce. It'll happen after Troy leaves for college, but we won't discuss it in front of him, I stated firmly. You'll have to be the one to break the news to him about Sergio being his half-brother, and it needs to happen soon. I'll be there to ensure you tell him the truth about a woman who cheated on her husband, not some romantic tale. But I bet he'll actually be pretty happy to have Sergio as a brother, considering how close they already are. AJ was pleased once she got over being mad at your poor treatment of me. Carrie's voice sounded strained as she asked, Does she know everything? Now she's interested, I chuckled bitterly. I didn't spill the beans. AJ's sharp, and she pieced things together over the years. She didn't have all the details, but she had a feeling. But because she wasn't sure and because you lied to her, she never came clean to me. She only shared what she knew when I asked. She felt guilty for not telling me sooner. Our son, though, is clueless, the bliss of youth and his trust in us. And you know Sergio has known about you two making a fool of me for years now. I've caught that look of pity in his eyes a few times. It's perfect when a teenager pities you because he knows his dad and your wife are trampling on your marriage. Everyone benefited from this except me. I got the short end of the stick. That's not true, Josh. I love you, she sobbed. I've been a good wife and mother. If Troy hadn't gotten sick, you'd still be happy and clueless. Can't we just go back to being happy? I never said no to closeness. So, you think I should be satisfied being your second choice, just because I didn't know what was happening? I should have always been your first choice, and there shouldn't have been any other options. But tell me, was I ever your first choice? I questioned. She blushed again. She stumbled over her words. At first, when we first got married, before I moved in with Robbie and Jorge, she admitted. So you're saying there was a time when we were intimate and you weren't thinking about Jorge or just doing it out of pity for me? How could you have kids with me if you were in love with someone else? I thought you deserved to have kids of your own. I do love you, remember? She defended. Right. How could I forget that? I retorted. But based on your actions, I guess you love our kids as much as you love your child with him. She glared at me, then glanced at Robbie and Jorge. They remained silent. This should be a private conversation, not involving Robbie and Jorge, Carrie said disdainfully. Are you kidding me? Robbie and Jorge caused this mess, I shouted. All three of them looked shocked by my outburst. They seemed on edge. All right, you all know I made a promise to Sergio, and I'm sticking to it, but I need something from you, Carrie. I need you to promise to be faithful to me until Troy goes off to college. That means no more trips to Spain without me, and no more visits with the Santiagos when I'm on reserve duty. Faithful means faithful. Break that promise, and I'll break mine to Sergio and file for divorce immediately. Got it? Robbie grinned, while Carrie and Jorge sat stunned and silent. It seemed Robbie understood, or maybe she just saw how the promise could benefit her too. Carrie and Jorge exchanged a long, hard look before Carrie quietly agreed, nodding her head slightly. Good. Anyone want more wine? I offered. After the Santiagos returned to Spain, I moved into the master bedroom suite in the basement guest room. Carrie and I had been sharing our bed while they were here, but we hadn't been intimate since Troy got sick. That suited me fine after learning about my wife and Jorge. Don't act childish, Josh. We've had closeness plenty of times over the years while I was sleeping with Jorge and you didn't know, Carrie snapped. That's the thing, Carrie, I retorted. I didn't know. Now that I know you've been with another man, it's not the same for me. Carrie looked sour, like she'd been sucking on a lemon. You men and your fragile egos. I'll be upstairs when you get over it, she said. I got the feeling she didn't realize how this was going to play out. Modern medicine is incredible. 6 months post-surgery, Troy was back to his old self, joking around and acting like a typical high schooler. While he'd need medication to prevent transplant rejection and couldn't play tackle football, he had his life back in almost every other aspect. It felt like the right time for him to learn the truth about his connection to Sergio. Carrie and I debated this for days. She leaned towards letting things unfold naturally, hoping Troy would eventually figure it out himself. I couldn't agree with that approach. You owe him the full story, just like we discussed months ago. And let's have a family meeting so AJ can hear it all too, I insisted. With a loud sigh, Carrie reluctantly nodded. Troy had turned 15 recently, and as a parent, I knew teenage minds could be hard to read. I chuckled, remembering my own confusion at that age and my dad's mysterious ways. This talk might not be easy, and I hoped Carrie realized that too. Watching from my lazy boy, it looked like Troy took the news of his being Sergio's half-brother really well, which I figured he would because he already loved Sergio like a brother. The how part, however, was a tougher sell. Wait, you had closeness with Uncle Jorge? You mean you effed him, as the kids would say? But you were married to Dad then, weren't you? That makes you what the kids would call a tramp, he shouted. Carrie started to yell back at our son, but I stopped her by squeezing her arm. She fell silent, looking ashamed, and the room grew quiet. I suppose slat would be the right term, I admitted, but it's my problem to handle. I only found out about this when you got sick. Your mother reached out to the Santiagos, hoping Sergio would be a match for your kidney transplant. She went to great lengths to help you, so the least you can do is appreciate that. Troy lowered his head, clearly feeling hurt and confused. I empathized with him. If anyone should be upset, it's me. And trust me, I am. But your mother and I will work through this together. I'm not leaving you guys. That's why I moved into the basement, I assured him. AJ seemed eager to speak up, but I subtly signaled for her to stay quiet. She relaxed back into the sofa. Carrie, sitting next to her, looked like she was about to collapse under the weight of guilt. A few months later, AJ left for Central Michigan University. Troy jokingly asked if he could go with her, but his serious expression told me otherwise. Carrie and I maintained civility around our son, attending his school events together. Despite our efforts to appear loving, I could see the strain on my wife, but I was determined to live my life and cherish my role as a father. Living separately under the same roof also took a toll on my wife. We lacked physical affection, loving words, and playful banter, and intimacy was non-existent. She couldn't initiate anything in bed because I wasn't there for her, literally. This situation wasn't easy for me either. Her betrayal dampened my desire. Whenever I felt aroused, thoughts of Carrie with Jorge for the past 2 decades replaced any excitement. Needless to say, I became quite adept at solo activities. Josh, can't we go back to how we used to be physically? We had a good bed life. I never refused you, you know. Can't we revive that? You have needs too, Carrie pleaded one evening about 3 months later when Troy was out with friends. I examined her. She was still attractive with a decent figure. This would be purely physical, as I no longer felt love for her. Though I still cared, those feelings were fading. It would be purely physical, not romantic. I'd seek my pleasure, and she could seek hers. I had no intention of exerting myself for her satisfaction. I suppose, but you'll have to come to my room. Knowing what I know now, you betrayed our marital bed countless times, and I won't be intimate with you there again, I replied hoarsely. Okay, I understand. I'll join you in a few minutes. Just need to freshen up a bit, she said. Carrie freshened up by applying some makeup, spritzing perfume, tidying her hair, and wearing my favorite lacy teddy beneath her robe. When she came into my room, she unveiled the teddy, spinning around for my approval. I had to quickly push thoughts of her with Jorge out of my mind to keep my composure. After we finished, I rolled away from Carrie, lying on my back, savoring the moment. In the past, we'd share this closeness, but those days were now just memories. I lamented their loss. As Carrie sniffled beside me, I knew she sensed my thoughts. Despite the urge to comfort her, I resisted. A while later, she dressed quietly and returned upstairs without a word. There was no conversation, no affectionate talk, just silence. Upstairs, I heard the shower running in our bathroom as I settled in the family room to watch TV. In gym shorts and a t-shirt, I was sitting when Troy arrived home. Something was clearly bothering him. Dad, it's been months since you've taken Mom out anywhere, he said. Will you ever forgive her and be a couple again? It was time for honesty. I reflected before responding. Troy, I don't think I can forgive her enough to go back to how things were. It was all a facade. Your mother loves Uncle Jorge, not me. I'm just her second choice. Knowing that, how can I return to that? Football teams have backup quarterbacks, but marriages don't have backup husbands, I explained. I'm sorry, son, but what we have now might be the best we can hope for. Troy seemed upset, but I believe he grasped the situation. He went to his room. Carrie caught on too. Every few weeks, she'd ask for alone time, code for closeness. I figured she probably took care of herself the rest of the time, like I did. She could have been sneaking out for all I knew, but she understood the consequences if she got caught. I'm not sure Carrie felt the weight of Troy's graduation like I did. Once, I might have cared, but I stopped worrying about her feelings. I didn't love her anymore. I cared, sure, given our shared history and kids, but her deceit had numbed my emotions. I used to think hate was love's opposite, but now I know it's indifference. I remember going to college with just clothes, undies, and a stereo. Troy took more with gadgets and boxes. Times had changed. Troy was excited and talked nonstop during the drive. Carrie barely got a word in, and I stayed quiet too. Troy didn't realize he dominated the conversation. The ride home without Troy was eerily silent. I drove most of the way. Carrie handled navigation and music. If I never hear another Michael Bolton song again, it'll be too soon. I could tell Carrie was feeling really down now that both kids were mostly out of the house. Carrie was a good mom, and I knew she loved the kids more than she cared for me. I might not have been her favorite person, but AJ and Troy were definitely her favorites. Seeing her so gloomy, she wasn't seeing the bigger picture. I thought I'd feel better when Carrie got served after we got home. But when she got the envelope, she looked crushed, burst into tears, and ran inside. It made me feel small. Setting up revenge plans after the trip seemed satisfying, but looking back, it was just petty. I realized I needed help. I knew our marriage was over from the moment I found out about her affair. I was keeping my promise to Sergio by staying with Carrie until Troy left for college. I gave her 2 extra days. I was in my room when I heard her knock. I told her to come in. "Do you hate me now, Josh?" she asked softly. "Have I ruined everything?" "Yes, everything's ruined because of you, Carrie. But I don't hate you. I just don't care about you anymore," I replied. "But we had something good for many years before you found out," she said. "Did we? For me, it was all a lie after you went to stay with Robbie and Jorge the first time. You didn't love only me like you promised. You didn't give yourself to me alone like you promised. You had a child with another man. Why couldn't you just be honest with me once you fell for Jorge? Why not just divorce me? You stayed, gave me 2 great kids, but for 18 years you deceived me. You took away 18 years I could have spent finding someone to share my life with, not being the second choice of a selfish woman. Go back to Jorge, Carrie. Can't you see? I'm setting you free." "But I did love you, Josh. Can't you see that? I couldn't have stayed with you for 20 years if I didn't love you. I might not be in love with you like I am with Jorge, but I truly do love you," she cried. "Your idea of love is way different from mine, Carrie. If you really loved me, you would have treated me right and not kept me as your backup. I deserve to be number one. I deserve to be the one you loved and desired. By deceiving me, you never gave me the chance to choose to be your number 2 or maybe find someone who wanted me as number 1. I gave you 2 great kids. We had a good life. Or so I thought. It's all gone now. You got what you wanted. Jorge got what he wanted. Robbie got what she wanted. And what did I get? Nothing. So what was your plan after the kids left, assuming I never found out about you and Jorge?" She hesitated before responding. "I guess I always thought I'd go back to Spain with Jorge and Robbie. I'm sorry, Josh. I guess I never really thought about you and my long-term plans," she said quietly. "I know," I replied just as quietly. "I won't fight the divorce," she whispered. I was surprised that both kids weren't supportive of my decision to divorce their mother. Initially, they were upset about her cheating, but she convinced them her love for me was genuine. As for her love for Jorge, well, that had been going on for so long they managed to justify it to themselves. Somehow, they also rationalized that I'd be okay being her second choice. "Aunt Robbie is fine with it. Why can't you be like her?" AJ questioned. "Aunt Robbie helped plan it all with Uncle Jorge and your mother. I was left out. Everyone but me was involved in this mess. Why exclude me? Because your mother knew I wouldn't agree. It's easier to ask forgiveness than permission," I explained. "Let me ask you, AJ, would you let your husband have another lover he cared about more than you?" "No way! I'd destroy him if he even suggested that," she stated firmly. "But this has been going on for over 20 years now." "So I should accept it because it's been happening for so long, like Aunt Robbie does, like you would if it happened to you?" She winced and looked away, signaling the end of the conversation. My kids confirmed my assumption that Carrie would go to Spain after the divorce. I missed the companionship, but not the life I had or didn't really have. Realizing I had lost trust in women, I sought counseling. I wasn't actively seeking a new relationship. I went on a few dates and occasionally had closeness, but it wasn't a priority anymore. I was surprised to find many single women in the 40 to 50 age range. I hadn't noticed when I was supposedly happily married. I never realized how much the dating scene had changed in the past 20 years. Before, men usually took the lead, but now it's more balanced. It took me a bit to adjust to this shift. I have to admit, it's quite a boost to the ego when a woman makes the first move. Robbie showing up at my door about 2 years after my divorce was a surprise. It took me a moment to recognize her, although she looked much the same as before. She was still quite beautiful. "Hey, Robbie, what brings you here?" I asked, still a bit shocked. "Just wanted to visit an old friend. If we still are friends," she replied softly. After offering her coffee, we sat down in the family room. She seemed uncomfortable, clearing her throat. "So, are we still friends, Josh?" she asked. I paused, thinking it over. "We used to be, or so I thought. Then I found out otherwise," I began, but she cut in. "No, that's not true," she insisted. "I always considered you a friend." "If that's the case, how could you do what you did to me?" I pressed. I was selfish and foolish, Robbie admitted. I never considered the consequences because I trusted George and Carrie. Carrie was like a sister to me. I never saw it coming. I put up with it because I got Sergio out of the deal. And after that, it was just for a few days here and there in all the years. And I absolutely loved it when you forbade her from seeing him for those few years. But then you divorced her and sent her back into his life and mine. I guess after all these years, I'm tired of being his second best woman. I completely get where you are coming from now. God, I was so stupid. Hurts, doesn't it? I asked smugly. She didn't answer but dropped her eyes. Finally, somebody showing a little remorse. I guess we can be friends again, of a sort. Friends linked by shared experience, I said. We talked long into the night. We switched from coffee to a bottle of Pinot Grigio and finished that. When she got ready to leave, I surprised her, and myself, by offering her my guest room. She accepted. It was fun, I had to admit, to have a piece of my old life back. I think we both enjoyed the familiarity. The second weekend she stayed with me, we went out to a restaurant for dinner, followed by hitting an upscale bar for drinks and dessert. It was two old friends, not a date, but somewhere along the way, hormones got involved. She was wearing a fairly tight dark blue dress that showed more than a hint of cleavage and a lot of muscular, tight legs. I certainly wasn't planning on anything happening, so I was a little surprised when I felt myself getting hard while we were eating dessert. I blushed, and she just knew. She reached across the table and took my hand. We continued holding hands for the rest of the night. We were about a block from my house when Robbie changed the game. "This doesn't have to mean anything, Josh," she rasped. "You're a handsome single guy, and I'm in an open marriage. We're consenting adults." I smiled brightly and reached for her hand, giving it a kiss. Clothes started hitting the floor almost as soon as we got back to my house, like you see in those chick flick romances. As we made our way to my bedroom, I discovered that Robbie was a fantastic kisser. Somewhere in the middle of that, she levitated off the bed and went stiff in the air before screaming at full volume. She started yelling something in Spanish at that point. I knew she was bilingual after all these years living in Spain, but since I'd only visited their home a few times, my Spanish was pretty bad. "English! Say it in English, babe. How do I know if you like something or not?" "If you're speaking a language I barely know," I said. I'm not going to lie and say it was the greatest experience of my life, although it was the best one I'd had since I found out about Carrie cheating on me several years ago. We went at it one more time that night and did it again in the morning. We showered together and enjoyed washing each other's bodies before I took her to IHOP for a great breakfast. We spent much of the rest of the day on the sofa in the family room, cuddling, kissing, and watching TV. She didn't go back to sleeping in the guest room for the remaining 3 weeks of her stay with me. I need to go back to Spain and divorce Jorge, then figure out what I want to do with the rest of my life, Robbie said. I know we've had our fun together, but both of us know we're not each other's long-term solution. Still, you're a hell of a good man, Josh. I'm really sorry I started the ball rolling on ruining your marriage. You didn't force her to do what she did, and at least you showed remorse. That's more than Carrie, I said. Well, I hope you find somebody that appreciates you for everything you bring to the table, and that's quite a lot, Robbie said. Carrie had been living with Jorge for 5 years, and my kids had both relocated to the south of Spain to be closer to their mother. I missed them, but not their attitudes. I was tired of apologizing for divorcing their mother for cheating on me. No one was more surprised than me when Troy called one Sunday at 6 a.m. Yeah, who the calls someone Sunday morning at 6? I didn't look to see who was calling. I just grabbed the phone and yelled, "What? This had better be a emergency or someone's dying," I yelled. Dad, it's me, Troy. Why are you so mad?" he asked. "It's 6 in the morning on a Sunday, Troy. Did you forget about the time difference?" I asked. Yeah, I guess I did, Dad," he said softly. "I'll call back later." "No, Troy, don't hang up. What did you need?" I asked. I'm not sure how to say this, Dad, but here goes. Did you know that AJ is sleeping with Uncle Jorge?" he announced more than asked. By the time he finished his statement, I was wide awake after getting only about 3 hours of sleep. It had been a very late night with a girl young enough to be dating my son, but that was a whole different story. "What? What the did you just say?" I yelled through the phone. "You heard me, Dad. I said AJ is sleeping with Uncle Jorge," he announced again. "How do you know that?" I asked, still at full volume. "We were all over at Uncle Jorge's, AJ, Sergio, and me, and when it got late, all the kids went to our bedrooms, leaving just Uncle Jorge and Mom up. In the middle of the night, I got woken up by a woman screaming out, and I realized it's not Mom. So I got up and went to AJ's door and listened for a bit because I was pretty sure I was going to have to off Sergio. For God's sake, he's her half-brother. But then it got worse. It wasn't Sergio, he said. Are you sure? I croaked out. Yeah, he whispered. Well, she is 27, Dad. I guess she can make her own decisions about whom she sleeps with. But still, it's just creepy. You know what I mean? He said. And your mother is good with this? I asked. He hesitated. Not really sure if she knows about this, he said. 2 days later, I was standing on Jorge's doorstep waiting for the fancy-ass doorbell to be answered. The woman of the house answered with a gasp. Josh, what are you doing here? Carrie asked with a very shocked look on her face. I was in the neighborhood and wanted to see my children. Got a problem with that? I said gruffly. She stepped aside and let me in. Why didn't you call? You could have stayed here if we knew you were coming, she said. I glared at her as all 3 kids and Jorge walked into the parlor. When the kids saw me, they came over for hugs, but Jorge stayed back. They all started talking at once, but fell silent as I approached Jorge with anger in my eyes. He raised his hands in surrender, but it didn't matter. I'm not a pro fighter, but I can handle myself. Fueled by rage, I landed my best punch on his nose. When he dropped to his knees, I delivered a powerful kick. It didn't crush his nuts, but his scream made my point clear. Stepping back, I breathed heavily, surveying the shocked faces. Uncle Josh, you promised not to hurt Dad for what he did with Aunt Carrie, Sergio cried out, but he stood firm. I seethed, watching Jorge in pain as Carrie rushed to him. I didn't break my promise to you, I yelled back. He got that for doing it with my daughter, your half-sister. Did you know he was doing it with your daughter? I asked, turning my attention to my ex-wife. Her expression shifted from fear to shock as she glanced at me, then back at Jorge. What's he saying? She asked Jorge. I'm old enough to decide who I sleep with, AJ asserted. I don't need permission from either of you. You're old enough to make your own mistakes, like being involved with a man who broke up your parents' marriage. But you, like your mother and the guy on the floor, should also know there are consequences to actions. And his recent one gave me the chance to give him the consequences I couldn't for being with your mother because I'd promised Sergio. I owe you thanks for giving me the chance to do something long overdue, but your choice of partners is disturbing considering everything. She blushed, then apologized to her mother. Carrie looked at AJ sternly, then turned to Jorge and slapped him hard, causing him to groan and pass out. That was a good one, Mom, Troy praised. I'm sorry, Uncle Josh. I didn't know about Dad and AJ. That's just wrong, Sergio said. You're right, Sergio. It's not your fault, and you don't need to apologize, I assured him. Kids, it was good to see you all, though AJ, you and I need to have a serious talk someday. Carrie, not so great to see you, but I've got some sightseeing to do before heading home. Now, if you don't mind. Oh, and you've got my number if Jorge wants to press charges against me. Just let me know and I'll turn myself in. That won't happen, Uncle Josh, I promise. Dad and I have a lot to discuss too, Sergio said. Yay! Everyone shouts when they land after their first parachute jump, and I was no exception. It was absolutely incredible. My toes touched the ground first, and since my legs were out in front of me, I gently sat down and let out a scream. Then I quickly got to my knees and then my feet, rushing back to grab my parachute. My heart was racing. I was too excited to even think about checking my Fitbit, but I could feel my heart pounding so hard and fast that it felt like my chest might burst, and I had a huge grin on my face. Yeah, 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 I shouted again as the jump master came over to congratulate me and make sure I wasn't injured. Nice jump, Josh, he cheered as I gathered my things and headed out of the landing area. As I walked towards the garage where others were coming out to greet me, I noticed I was sweating a lot, and every sound around me seemed sharper, louder. Maybe that's what happens in a close call experience, I thought to myself. Okay, I know I was being a bit dramatic, maybe more than a bit, but beside witnessing the birth of my 2 children, this was the most incredible moment of my life. Better than getting married, even better than my first time having closeness. I may never be able to fully explain what I just experienced. At 51 years old and divorced for quite some time, I'd been feeling pretty down. But a recent trip to Spain changed everything. Specifically, giving Jorge Santiago a beating lifted my spirits like nothing else could. The first day back in the States, I practically leaped out of bed. I put on my New Balance sneakers and hit the road. I had been slowly getting back into jogging over the past year, but that morning was different. I breezed through 7.2 miles at a pace of 7:30 per mile, much faster than my usual 8 minutes. I arrived at work practically bouncing with energy. I was on cloud nine. My admin, Teresa, picked up on it right away. 5 minutes after I arrived, she showed up at my door with her coffee and notepad, ready to catch up after my week-long absence. But the charade didn't last long. Teresa sat down, looked me in the eye, and said, "Okay, spill. You spent the week in Spain getting some action, didn't you?" "Even better, Teresa," I replied. "I found my mojo. Who knew it was hiding out in southern Spain?" "That's fantastic, Josh. I'm really happy for you. You deserve it." I decided to enroll in a couple of classes at the local college just for fun. With over 1 billion people in China, I figured I should learn more about their culture. The second class was even more lighthearted, focusing on classic rock. Most of the students were around my age, but there were a few younger ones who probably got hooked on their parents' music growing up. About a month later, I got this wild idea to go skydiving. I don't know what possessed me, considering I'm terrified of heights, but I felt like I needed to face that fear head on, and jumping out of a plane from 2,000 feet up seemed like the most insane thing I could do. Maybe that's the downside of living solo. There's no one around to talk some sense into you when you're about to do something utterly nuts. Seriously, who in their right mind volunteers to leap out of a perfectly good airplane? But there I was, signing up for the class to learn how to do it. The class was all right, but everything changed when we suited up, grouped up, and headed out to the plane we were supposed to jump from. To cut to the chase, I'm thankful I didn't have a weak heart, or I might have been a goner. But it turned out to be an incredible experience, one I'm glad I tried. Just once. After our jumps, a bunch of us rookies stuck around, chatting and joking as we sipped on Cokes and teased each other about our less than graceful landings. I was munching on some vending machine M&Ms when this high-pitched whirlwind burst into the garage. She was clearly still buzzing from the jump, a few inches shorter and a few octaves higher than usual. It took her a moment to wrangle off her helmet, and when she did, out tumbled this cascade of curly blonde hair, revealing these big, bright blue eyes, and a smile that could have come straight from a toothpaste ad. For the second time that day, I thought my heart might just stop. I nearly choked on my candy when she peeled off her jumpsuit. It was a warm day, and she was wearing this snug t-shirt and jeans that were, well, let's just say they left little to the imagination. Tight with a capital T doesn't even begin to cover it. She seemed to be around 30, but I later learned she was actually 44. Her name turned out to be Evie Abraham. Maybe because she was so small, she appeared even livelier than the rest of us. I couldn't help but keep my eyes on her as we sat around the table sharing our skydiving stories. I hoped I wasn't obvious in my staring, and definitely hoped I wasn't drooling. Subtly, I glanced at her left hand, checking for a ring. There was none. After hanging out together for a while, Evie got up and headed towards the parking lot. Without hesitation, I got up and followed her. That day at the airfield left me with a lasting memory and a date set for the following Saturday night. Our first date was at a Chinese restaurant. For the first 10 minutes, Evie excitedly talked about her skydiving experience. I totally understood, considering we shared that adventure. Then, we delved into our personal lives. I opened up about my ex-wife and kids while she shared about her late husband and her own 2 children. She was widowed at 34 when a drunk driver offed her husband, leaving her to raise their kids alone. After sharing her story, Evie fell quiet. I saw tears welling up in her eyes, though she fought hard to hold them back. "I made a promise to myself not to cry for myself anymore after the first year without Dan," she explained. I realized I was crying out of self-pity, but that's not what Dan would have wanted. He was the kind of guy who'd say, "That's enough tears. It's time to move forward." So that's what I did. We'll never forget Dan, but we'll honor him every day by moving forward and living good lives. Her words hit me deeply. I didn't say it, but I had shed many tears over the years, grieving for my own loss. "He seems like a wise guy, offering advice to a stranger," I murmured. She smiled broadly, a telltale sign of her happiness, tilting her head to the right. Being both mother and father to her kids, she grew into a bit of a tomboy in her 30s. She mastered throwing a baseball and football, and boasted about her skills in hockey. Despite not playing sports as a child, she became an involved parent, learning about various sports and how to tend to her kids' injuries. "I can handle cuts like a pro and ice up injuries with ease," she said proudly. For our second date, I took her to a Cincinnati Reds baseball game. She grabbed my program and began scoring the game, impressing me with her skill. My son played baseball and my daughter played softball. I took on the role of the official stats guy for both teams, she explained, using air quotes for emphasis. Standing at 5'0", she exuded enthusiasm and energy. She often wore tight tees, jeans, and sneakers, seamlessly fitting into my world and comfortably snuggling under my arm. After our first date, she gave me a chaste kiss on the cheek. On our second date, she kissed me softly on the lips several times. As our dates continued, the kissing became more intense, but I never felt the right moment to take things further until our sixth date, when she made the move. "Am I not what you're looking for, Josh?" she asked while we were making out on her sofa. "You've never made a move on me, and I want more than just that," she said, smiling as she tilted her head to the right. I felt myself blush, feeling like I was back in high school. "It's been a while for me." "Not that," I said, noticing Evie grinning. "I think we could have something special. And I'm afraid of messing it up," I admitted, my heart pounding. "Don't worry, honey, that won't happen on my end. Now how about you show me how fast you can get unclothed," she teased, her eyes sparkling. We got engaged 6 months later and had a small wedding 6 months after that with just her kids, my son, and Sergio present. AJ, although invited, chose not to come since I didn't invite her new husband, Jorge, who Carrie divorced immediately after learning about his affair with her daughter. As expected, we didn't go to Spain for our honeymoon.